Hey everybody. So for today's board work, we're going to be focusing on the monopoly graph. And I just want to remind you that, remember, these graphs are your ability to tell a story. You may be able to sort of describe what makes a monopoly, barriers to entry and things like this, but when you're able to draw a graph, you can explain so much more about it, and so it's really your chance to tell a story. So to start with, let's just look at why in perfect competition were we staring at a horizontal demand curve, and why in a monopoly are we staring at a downward sloping demand curve? Basically, anytime that you see a downward sloping demand curve in a firm, we can say that this firm has market power. Remember, the monopolist is going to be searching for the price to charge, okay? And so they have some market power, so they face a downward sloping demand curve, which means that they can price higher, price lower. There's elasticity to worry about, whereas in perfect competition, there's a market price. It's horizontal. They don't get a choice. Now, what about this? What about this curve over here? This marginal revenue. What is happening here? Why is it separate from the demand curve? In perfect competition, remember the Mr. Darp line? It was the same. Why does it look like this? The reason that the marginal revenue curve looks like this goes to the definition of marginal revenue itself. Remember, marginal revenue, what do those two terms mean? Marginal means the next one. Revenue means money coming in. So marginal revenue is money coming in from the selling of the next unit, okay? Well, what is happening here? Well, if the monopolist chooses to sell it at this price, he has to sell each and every unit at that price, right? If he wants to sell one more unit, okay, because the monopolist is the industry. There is no separate industry graph over here. Remember, the monopolist is one seller. They are the industry. If this is their demand curve and they want to sell another unit or another 5 units, they have to lower their price. Look. So if you're lowering your price on the next unit, that means you have to lower your price on all the units that you've sold beforehand, okay? And so the marginal revenue then for each and every unit after that is going to be less than what you sold it for, right? So the marginal revenue, that is why that occurs that way, and if you look in the lecture slides, you can see it points it out a little bit. So that's that. Now, in every situation, we have to put on the cost curves onto the graph. So I'm going to show a monopolist earning a profit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in an ATC, and I'm going to add in an MC. Okay? Now it doesn't really matter where you put it. I'll show you a different scenario in a little bit. But basically the monopolist follows the rule of all firms, which is that they produce the quantity where MR equals MC. They produce the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. It's that powerful rule that we talk about, right? So because you don't want to produce where marginal cost of that next unit is above the marginal revenue, that means you're going to be losing money on that unit. But the monopolist is different. So they get to produce the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, but they get to charge at that quantity where their demand curve is taking them. Okay? So in this case, let's say that price is up here. We're just gonna call it $20, okay? And you can pretty easily figure out their profit. What they sell it for, right? What their costs are. This large box is going to be their profit, okay? So again, they produce where MR equals MC, they get to charge up at the demand curve, and that is their box of profit, okay? So what are some other things to point out on this graph? One, you see that the marginal revenue curve actually crosses the demand curve, crosses the origin and goes into the negative. That is definitely possible. you could get to the point where your marginal revenue is negative. You could simultaneously think about a graph, an invisible graph, being underneath this graph that I'm going to call the total revenue curve. Okay? Total revenue. As a monopolist is lowering their price to sell more units, what is actually happening is total revenue is going up, all the way up until this hits 0. And when it goes negative, all of a sudden total revenue is going down. So a monopolist never wants total revenue to go down, so this is a very important point. If I take this point up, a monopolist will never produce in this portion of their demand curve. This is called the inelastic portion. We know that from previous lectures. This is the inelastic portion from here to here, and we know that they will not produce in there. So that's a special point to think about as well. So let's erase this and let's look at a couple of other things. Back with a clean graph because I want to show a couple of other points. So again, I'm going to describe the 3 points that we generally see on a monopolist graph. So to just review, this is the MR equals MC point, right? That's the quantity they're going to produce. And if they are unregulated, if they are a monopoly that is unregulated by the government, they're going to charge this price. Okay, so this P1 is going to be unregulated. Okay, that is the typical price. They're going to earn lots of profit. Okay, now we know that monopolists are not efficient, right? Because they get to produce less than the socially optimal quantity and they get to charge more because they're a monopolist, right? They have market power. So there are some other points where you could regulate this monopolist. The market, the original supply and demand market, that equilibrium point we call the socially optimal quantity because it maximizes producer and consumer surplus way back from previous videos. One thing that you see here is that where would that equilibrium be? It would be right here. The marginal cost curve is the supply curve for the firms. In fact, you could, when you draw your supply and demand graph, your just original ones, this could be your marginal cost and this could be your marginal benefit, right? It does not have to be supply and demand. So the marginal cost curve is the supply curve for the firm. We have the demand curve, so that is where supply meets demand. That is going to be the place that maximizes consumer and producer surplus. So what do we actually see here when you're charging up here? We have the creation of deadweight loss. In a perfect market, the equilibrium is right here, but this firm is producing less and charging more, right? So in this situation, the consumer surplus is only up here, right? This is the consumer surplus because these people were willing to pay more than the price. Well, what happened to all of these people in here? Okay? This area in here is called dead weight loss. This is the dead weight loss, okay? Because we know that monopolists are inefficient. So you could regulate this market and force the monopolist to produce at this point, which is the socially optimal point. And if you did that, you would get rid of this deadweight loss. You would get rid of this deadweight loss, and consumer surplus and producer surplus would be maximized. Now, how would you do that? How do you force a monopolist to produce more? Well, you would probably subsidize them, to be quite honest. They're the only producer in the market. You're not going to do it by allowing competition. I mean, you could do antitrust legislation to get more competitors into the market, and that would bring the price down a little bit. Or you could subsidize them. The last point is called the break-even or the fair return. Okay, and that is the point at which all of their costs are covered, but they're not earning any economic profits. If you notice here at this point, they're still earning economic profit, but at this point, only their costs are covered, so they're just earning normal profit. So you would have to subsidize them even more to get them to produce these quantities, right? Quantity 1 and quantity 2. So again, that just shows us that, you know, how inefficient the monopolist is with that creation of that deadweight loss, and how you get them to produce more through regulation. Okay? So hopefully that breaks down a little bit of the different parts of the monopoly graph.